the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Rate and review the show at kevinmd.com/rate. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/follow. Today in the show, we have Liana Meffert. She is a medical student and she wrote the Kevin MD article, It Goes Without Saying, a residency interview. Liana, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
So we'll get into your article in a little bit, but first off, can you share your story and journey to where you are today?
Yeah, it was kind of a circuitous route. I started out as a psychology major, going to school in California. I ended up transferring to Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. I ended up graduating with a BA and a BS. I did some creative writing there, mostly poetry, and I've kind of kept it up since. I'm at medical school in Iowa City at University of Iowa, and I'm graduating this year. So in just a couple of weeks here, I will be off to DC, starting an emergency medicine residency at Georgetown.
Wonderful, and congratulations on your match.
Well, thank you.
So tell me how writing has influenced you as a medical student.
It's an interesting question because I've just been writing the whole time, so there's no control for that. But I think it's made me a more sane medical student. It's kind of like it's dual purpose in that I create stuff and I get to share it with everyone, but it's also totally a coping skill and mechanism for me. It's a way for me to kind of process things that are happening. You know, my favorite part about writing is just the process of figuring out what I'm writing about and what I want to share as I'm writing it. And sometimes a year will go by between an event and it'll kind of circle back to me and I'll be like, oh, this is what I wanted to talk about this whole time. So it's a very, it's just a very gratifying process.
So you mentioned that writing was a coping mechanism for you, and I've talked to a lot of medical students on the show, and medical school, as we both know, is a very, very difficult and trying process. Can you recall an event or an example or a story of how you use writing as a coping mechanism for some of the obstacles and difficulties that you face?
Yeah, I mean, I think this piece in and of itself is a good example of that. You know, residency interviews are really important. You know, how else would you know where you wanted to go? But at the same time, I think it can be a really trying experience, especially right now. It feels very depersonalized because we're not even seeing people in person and you get asked the same questions over and over again. Sometimes the same question multiple times within the same interview or like between interviewees, but for the same school. And so I kind of found myself thinking about, you know, what are the things that I really want to say? And, you know, not that anything I said was not genuine, but it was, you know, it was filtered. And, you know, there's a certain way that you're expected to present yourself, which is kind of at the intersection between personal and professional. And I started kind of coming up with these alternative answers. And it was kind of a way for me to sort of, you know, vent in a way that felt really meaningful to me to be able to just kind of get out into the world, like these other ways of communicating in ways that I was thinking.
Yes, and you talk about that. It's your Kevin MD article. It Goes Without Saying, a residency interview. So give us an example of a common question that you were asked and, you know, how you had to give a more or less filtered response and how you know, kind of had to hide what you really wanted to say.
Most people will ask you, so tell me about yourself. That's kind of the first question. And it's such a broad question, you know, it's like, and at the same time, they'll ask you these questions and sometimes it'll be like you have 2 minutes left in the interview and you're like, you know, how do I summarize myself in 2 minutes? Yeah. What parts do I choose to emphasize? Which parts do I choose to not emphasize? You know, for me, I talked a lot about writing because it was really important to me and it felt like it was a really genuine presentation of myself. But at the same time, I was leaving out other stuff that was equally important in different ways. So the second part of that question then it really depended on the day. You know, sometimes what I wanted to say is, hey, I'm out of cereal this morning and it really sucked. You know, just, you know, something like, this is what's happening to me right now, you know, but instead, usually it's like where I went to school and, you know, an important patient experience that I had and, you know, where I grew up. And, you know, sometimes that just doesn't really feel like the most relevant part of who I am today in a way.
So tell me about that interview process. I know during the pandemic, it really threw everything for a loop. Were a lot of your interviews virtual? Were they?
Well, they were 100%. They were all virtual.
So what did you learn by going through that virtual interview experience?
I learned that I saved a lot of money. Besides that, you know, in some ways it was refreshing because as so many parts of the pandemic, as you've seen play out, as people are just kind of trying to find their way in these sort of foreign territories. And so it was a much more in some ways it was a little bit more personalized because people were interviewing from their homes and their dogs were climbing on their laps and you could hear their kids in the background. And so I did appreciate that element of it. And it definitely just felt like we were kind of all in the same boat in a way, that maybe, everyone was sort of, the schools have been doing it. This was like their second year doing it. And obviously it was our first time. A lot of people, it was their first time doing it. But, everyone's still really just trying to figure it out. And there was definitely a sense of just kind of wing. And so that was another kind of interesting component of the virtual interviews that I hadn't anticipated.
Now, as a medical student, you've been through so many in-person interviews. I've talked to other medical students, and sometimes they do different things virtually versus in person. So when you were interviewing for residency virtually, anything different that you did versus an in-person interview?
The last time I've interviewed was 4 years ago for medical school. So, I'm sure I'm a different interviewee than I was 4 years ago. It is strange to be able to see yourself while you're interviewing, right? So I'm sure that plays into it in ways that I can't really predict. I think that I put a lot more sort of emphasis in my facial expressions and smiling. It's just like, your body language is only really conveyed from here up. So you kind of have to do a lot more work with your face and trying to connect with a person just through your own facial expressions.
So you imagine doing emergency medicine, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So tell me about what you're looking forward to and what were some of the reasons why you decided to match into emergency medicine.
I'm looking forward to having a lot of responsibility, actually. It's equally terrifying and exciting, but I've been a student for my whole life, and this is kind of the first step, and you're sort of at this transition between you're still a student, but you're also sort of professional. And so I'm sort of looking forward to taking on that next step of responsibility and really seeing, how I rise to the occasion of it. And in terms of kind of why the specialty, a number of reasons. I think you kind of, as a medical student, you rotate through different specialties and you sort of just get a sense for like what fits and what doesn't and kind of where you feel happiest. And for me, I really liked the fast pace of the emergency medicine. I really like, for better or worse, there's not really continuity of care. You're kind of on or you're off. And as someone that's looking to continue writing and really make that part of my career, I sort of wanted to have a clear delineation between my physician professional life and my writing life. And so it fit well for me. And kind of something I noticed more actually as I committed to the specialty was that there's a lot of really incredible emergency medicine writers because there's some incredible stories. Frank Hyler is one that comes to mind right now. I reread all his stuff recently, and it makes me feel like there's a lot of potential here for just really finding kind of a common ground between the writing and the experience. And I think it's also probably a really nice, like kind of like we said before, like a coping mechanism. This is a specialty that has a lot of PTSD and a lot of burnout. And I'm, very cognizant of that. And I think if I didn't have writing, I might not be going into that specialty.
We're talking to Leanna Mefford. She's a medical student. She wrote the Kevin MD article, It Goes Without Saying, a residency interview. So now that you have matched, you've gone through the interview process. As you reflect on that, any pieces of advice that you could give to other medical students who will be going through that same process?
Oh, there's so many random pieces of advice I could give on this. I did couples matching actually with my partner. So that's a whole nother story there's a whole lot of other variables to consider if you're couples matching. But I think some of the best pieces of advice I got is I talked to a lot of residents over the phone at programs I interviewed at. And I always kind of asked them, what would you tell yourself that was matching last year? What advice would you give yourself? And it's so cliche. And they always say like, it'll all work out. And that's kind of, but it really is, you have to really embrace the fact that you have you have some control, but you don't have a lot of control over the process. And I think something my partner and I did that I really appreciated was we set aside time during the day to discuss sort of our ideas for where we wanted to go to residency and how we were going to negotiate that and how we wanted to rank things. And the rest of the time we led a completely different life, and we separated that because you can really run yourself in circles during the months where you're deciding how to rank schools. And you really need to kind of partition that a little bit so you don't go crazy in the process, because it's a long time to be figuring out what your life is going to look like for the next 3 years or 4 years, and then, for the rest of your career. So, think about it hard, do your best when you are thinking about it, but also give yourself time off. You don't, you kind of need that time to do other things too.
And my final question, what are some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience?
I think just, keep creating. I think this piece really came together because I started challenging myself. I had this whole list of residency questions that I kind of wanted to prep for, which turned out to be pretty spot on with a lot of questions I actually got. But then kind of throughout the residency season, I also was looking at these questions and I would challenge myself to write an answer that was something that I wanted to give that I hadn't given. And so I think, to keep being creative and also look for creativity and opportunities in places where you wouldn't really expect it, because it's really everywhere, outside the hospital even. So I think it's a way to help yourself help with work-life balance.
Liana, thank you so much for sharing your story time and insight. And thanks again for being on the show.